All right, good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. This morning we're doing a risk and uncertainty workshop. The ASMSC does not have a risk and uncertainty policy. The 3 East Coast councils have developed policies that are in different stages of maturity and use by the 3 councils. And at the commission, the management science and the assessment science committees both have started risk policies and different ideas on how to move forward with handling risk and uncertainty in the ASMFC management. Those efforts have been productive, but they haven't been carried through all the way to a final policy. And the work that Jason and some others have been working on, and he'll explain a little bit more of it, have capitalized on what those folks have done and taken it a bit further. Jason provided an update on the decision tree and a number of other things that are going into the risk policy a few meetings back. And at this meeting, what the overall goal is for obviously the commissioners to receive an update on the status of the policy, and Jason's got a number of interactive decision points that he wants feedback from the commissioners on, and then that will feed into the development of a final policy. So we won't leave here with a final policy. We'll leave here with a lot more information and input into Jason and his working group to finalize the policy and bring that back for final approval at a subsequent meeting. So with that, I think the importance of the policy is just to provide some repeatability and transparency for the commission. There's a lot of, obviously the commission handles 27 different species, and risk and uncertainty are handled about 27 different ways in 27 different species. And is there some consistency that we can apply to how the boards consider risk and consider uncertainty as they're working through the management process? So that's a quick background on it. I think it's a good project. It's a great project for us to move forward on. It's been in the action plan, I don't know, 3 or 4 years at least, and now it's really got some traction and it's moving forward. So I think with that, Jason's gonna be the one that really shepherds us through the next couple hours, and he can provide, or you also get your little tutorial on how to use your clickers that you were just given. And with that, if there's any questions, happy to answer it, but if not, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jason. He can run the show for the next little while. All right, Jason, it's all yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bob. Thanks. I thought when I was thinking through this, I thought I was going to be looking out at a fairly empty table here because it was so early. So thank you all for waking up. And I've never done anything like this before. I hope it'll be fun. And the idea here is just to walk you through this and really give you a tangible sense of what we're thinking about, how we could possibly structure this type of process. I should probably introduce myself. Jason McNamee. I work for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and I've been working on this. I've introduced this to you a couple of times in a couple of different ways, but working with Katie Drew and Max Appelman and Shanna while she was here, and then with the ASC and MSC committees, we've got it to a pretty good point here, and we are ready to bring it to you and walk you through this. So I'm going to click this. Did it work? Okay, so far so good. Okay, so, oh good, it's working. So here's just a quick structure overview of what we're going to do. So we're going to start off with some clicker training, and Jessica's going to help us out with that. And we've got kind of a mock slide on there to let you practice. And then once we're done with that, we're going to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to step through all of the decisions. We're going to go through all of them. I imagine this, when you operationalize it, that some of this information will be populated by your technical committees, for the specific species that you're working on. But here, I wanted you to have a sense of the whole thing from top to bottom, and so you'll go through all of the decisions. You'll use your fancy clickers that you have in front of you to make your decisions, and then I'm not suggesting we'll be using clickers for voting from now on, although if this is super fun, maybe we will. But you'll use these clickers, and again, we'll talk you through exactly how that's going to work, because there's a number of buttons on there, but we tried to minimize the complexity. Once we get through everything, we're going to review the results and then talk about next steps. So with that, let's talk about the clickers, the best part of the whole workshop. And I will turn it over to Jessica to walk you through that.
Hi, I'm Jessica. So for the clickers, you'll have numbers 1 through 10 on there, and you just want to click whichever number is appropriate for the question. They turn on automatically when you press a button, so just clicking that single number, you don't need to click OK or clear or anything. And if you click multiple numbers, say 3 and then 2, it will only record the last number you click. Each number is going to have a countdown timer, and so you'll just need to put in your number before the end of that timer.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. And so hold your questions for now. I think it'll make sense as we flip to the next slide here, but the way that the presentation is going to work, hopefully you all will be able to see it, but I'll verbally describe the slide as well. But I'm going to flip to the slide. It's going to have a question on it. You're going to read that question. You'll decide on your answer, and then click the button for that question. So, sorry, seeing different things on my screen than what is up there, so I'm not sure what's coming next. So, okay, an important aspect of this, I'm going to show you a diagram that kind of works you through the flow chart, and at that point, I'm going to describe, what we're going to flip to. I'm going to pause, so if you have questions on what you're supposed to be thinking about with this particular question, we'll answer those. But when I flip to the slide, there's a timer on it, so it's go time. You got to make your decision and click away. I think once the timer stops, all clicking after that point won't be counted. So, and we'll see there's a little counter at the bottom as well that tells us how many people have weighed in. So I'm going to go ahead and click. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong direction. Okay, so our very first question, and the timer's going there. I gave this one a minute, so we're okay. But for this test run, what I want you to do is put in your favorite Olympic sport, and you only have 3 options. So curling, downhill skiing, luge, or other. So if you don't like any of those, you can click other. And the numbers up there correspond with the numbers on your clicker. So go ahead and click your answer to this question.
No, we set it up so that we tested it. We set it up so that
Sorry, I gotta go.
Okay, time is up. It looks like everybody likes downhill, or the majority likes downhill skiing, with a other being a close second. So that's it. So when you look up at the screen there, you'll see how the voting went. And as we're going through the actual questions, it's going to be, even though it was very close, the answer is going to be number 2, or whatever number ends up winning the vote. And so we'll see how many, if anyone missed clicking, or if we're not picking up the people on the back. We're not sure of the range of this thing yet, but that's how it works. So Any questions, any technical difficulties besides the ones that I'm having? Go ahead, David.
Did you say that we're only going to see the answer? In other words, if this is the question, well, this is the question. We're only going to see the number 2. We're not going to have a clue that number 4 was a close second, missed by 1 vote. Right? There's no way to know how close it was.
Yep, you'll see both. So if you look up at the screen, all of the options are up there. And so you see the bar. The red one had the maximum number. You can see the 10 above that. And then number 4 has a 9 above it. So that was a close.
But we'll see all the bars when we answer.
Exactly.
Afterwards. Okay.
Yep. Yes, Robert.
I want to explain my vote. No, sorry. So you hit the number and then OK.
Just the number.
It's
So
okay if you hit
when
okay.
you get an OK up top, does that signify anything? Does that tell me I'm right?
Yes. So you can always have that self-affirmation after every vote. Now, you can also hit OK, and it's not going to do anything. I think your vote will still count, but you don't need to. If you're really enjoying clicking, go ahead. Okay. Oh, yes.
Okay, now how do you clear this thing? Or just the next number you punch is going to go in?
Yeah, excellent question. So once that timer stops, everything freezes, resets, so you guys don't have to do anything. It will automatically do that. Excellent question. Okay. Great. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the introduction here. And so we're going to go through a very specific example, in this case, of what we're trying to achieve a risk tolerance for. But this type of process can be used for many different risk decisions made by the Commission. As we've talked through this before with you all, we decided it's more tractable to kind of take this in pieces and do it, not try and do this in an omnibus fashion, but to kind of make a single example and work through that so we can understand it well. And so that's the strategy that we're using here. But remember that the goal here is to create a systematic process to meet the Commission's risk policy goals. So we're just trying to create a system that allows us to kind of track through these decisions. I'll suggest that you are all doing this already when you're making your decisions. What this does for us, though, is it lets us describe it better, and I'll talk more about that at the end, because this was a topic that we discussed at length in the working group. So the specific example we're going to go through today is a decision process to get to an F target. So remember that, because it's important. The reason that we're going through this today is to end up at a probability of achieving a fishing mortality target. The example that we've been talking about with you for the past couple of meetings is striped bass. So we've tried a couple of different things. We brought you a data poor and a data rich species early on. It was bluefish and something else, but in the end, this is what we settled on. It was kind of relevant to work through striped bass, because we knew by the time we got to this meeting, we'd be in a benchmark process, and it could possibly be relevant. And so that's how we ended up at that. And so again, the goal of this workshop is to give you a tangible sense of how this process can work in a very real way. Okay, thanks. I'll probably have to do that here and there. So the values, we're going to assign a value to each decision that we make. We kept the math simple here. So these are not real values, and the reason I bring that up, I don't want you to get overly hung up on I don't agree with that value. We've made the math easy was our goal here, more for me than for you when I have to tally this at the end. And so, don't get hung up on the value, but understand that each decision that you make is going to get a score or a value assigned to it. And that's going to then accumulate until we get to the end and we get our final result. But at this point, we're just trying to keep things tractable. And so once we get to the end, we're going to talk about whether you liked this, whether you want to see it refined further, and that refinement is going to have to come from the technical committees. We've done as well as we can to this point to kind of think about questions that are relevant for striped bass, but I'm certain that the striped bass technical committee will do a better job of refining these because they're the content experts on striped bass. So discussion at this point is to not do this for every species all at once. We want to keep this, going in this incremental fashion because it will make it easier, both workload-wise and, it will evolve, I'm sure, as we kind of work through this. And we can customize this. One of the, with the regional councils, one of the criticisms that we hear is they're too rigid in some cases. And so we've kept that in mind as we've worked through this and provided a lot of flexibility. In fact, the whole point of this is to have that flexibility in there. And so part of that flexibility is being able to customize these for the species that you're working on.
Just click on, and it's already on that, so just click on that.
Click. Okay. All right. So the decision tree, it's broken into 4 tiers. There's this initial decision, and it's pretty simple, and that is you've gone through a stock assessment or you are trying to develop some specifications, and so you've made this initial decision to conduct management. And that's kind of that starting point. That's what enters you into the decision tree. The decision then goes to this information availability decision, and is this something that has a lot of data for it, or is it something that is data poor? And so that's kind of that initial bifurcation of the decision tree. Then you go through a series of decisions that are quantifiable. So these are the ones coming directly out of the stock assessment that you can assign specific values to, because you get, potentially if you're in a data-rich situation, you get a distribution of uncertainty around whatever status metric you're looking at, fishing mortality or biomass. And so you can make a really specific quantified decision. And then we get to this bottom tier of the decision tree. This is where a lot of the flexibility comes in, and that is these qualitative decisions, things about economic impacts and social impacts and things of that nature. And so you'll see that as we step through the process. Again, flexibility is a key element for the risk policy. And then once we step through the questions, we'll end up with a board preferred probability with regard to being at or below the F target. And so now we've got that information. It's very clear. It's communicated to your technical folks who can then go run their projections because they know the risk that you want and get you information so that we can do quota setting and projections and all of that sort of thing. Hey, it worked. Okay, so we're going to start getting into it. And again, this is the striper example. The risk policy is triggered by a determination that management action is needed. Based on previous discussions, the first step is to determine what kind of assessment we are dealing with. So this first question, it's an easy one. For striped bass, we've got a lot of information. We've got a good stock assessment. It's a statistical catch at age assessment, which is one of the premier assessment techniques for species, used for a lot of our most well-managed species. So we're going to call it data rich as opposed to data poor. So as we enter into the decision tree, one of the starting points, and again, this is negotiable and could be modified depending on the species or as an overall policy from the commission. But again, to make things simple and to actually work off of what was done last time, we're going to assume that the default is a 50% probability of meeting your F target, so meeting that management goal with a 50% probability. And again, this can be customized depending on the specific situation. So this is what I was talking about. I'm going to have one of these slides up. This is going to be your opportunity to ask questions. And then when I flip to the next slide, that's when the timer starts, and you'll have to click at that point. But here's the first couple of tiers. There's the initial decision. We've decided we need management action. The little red arrow on there is just showing you the level that we're working on it at this point. It's not showing you the answer. They'll always be on the left there. But as I tried to show you as well as I could in trying to keep it somewhat readable up on the screen, I've got a couple of layers on there so you can see how you progress through the decision tree, but you know, that arrow is there just to show you the level that we're at, and so you can kind of track your way through here. So again, we've decided we needed management. What's the information we have available? I've already suggested that it is data rich. You could disagree and vote differently if you disagree. But are there any questions before we flip to the next slide where the voting will commence? Okay. So here we go. Get your clickers ready. So if it's data rich, it's number 1. If it's data poor, it's number 2. All right, we had one disagreement there. That's fun anyways. Thank you for doing that, whoever did it. So we can see overwhelmingly we are in a data-rich situation. For this, this level of the decision tree, we're not assigning a value. That's what sets that default value of 50%, so we don't have to track anything there yet, but looks like this is working so far. Nice job. So we're in a data-rich situation for striped bass. Oh. Okay. Okay, so data rich and data poor will likely have separate decision trees, separate default values. It's a presumption, but I think that would make sense. Or at least it will dictate the range of possible risk outcomes at the end. But like I said, we'll kind of work through and let this evolve as we go. So our next decision is to determine stock status, important high-level decision to make. So here we have what we refer to as the species matrix. What this is, I think it was Max who went around and put a piece of paper in front of you with lots of writing on it, and we're not expecting you to synthesize all of this information right now, but we're going to use this, and we're going to develop these for all of the species. So we have this clearinghouse for the information, kind of a quick read, almost like a matrix version of the executive summary for you. And you can kind of look through that and find information on it. And this is the location where you can quickly get at stock status information. And I've got a couple of slides where I'll blow that up on the screen for you so you don't have to squint too hard at the paper in front of you. But we just wanted you to see you've got that information there in a readily accessible place where you can find that. And so here we're going to assign values of 2.5% for each decision. So if stock status is good, you're going to subtract 2.5%. So this is an important concept. If you're making a decision where you want to be more risk tolerant, so if stock status is good, you can be a little more risk tolerant, you're going to subtract 2.5 or whatever. What that does is it moves you now in the direction of being more risk tolerant. If you want to be more risk averse, you add that 2.5%. And so that's how it moves, and that pushes you, if you think about the last meeting where I talked about this being like that game show Plinko, you move kind of right or left down the decision tree, and that moves you at a higher risk or a lower risk tolerance depending on the direction. So here, again, you've got this in front of you. I just took a quick snapshot. This is the risk matrix, and I think it's two-sided, so we're on the front side here where you have some of the bigger boxes. But what we want you to zoom in on are, you've got, again, this is where we would have found that we are in a data-rich situation. We've got an age-structured, forward-projecting statistical catch-at-age model. That's there. And then you can also find your overfishing and overfished definitions. And so you've got those right in front of you there. And so here we are now at the next tier down. We're now in those quantifiable decisions that we can make. So we recognize that management's needed. We've decided we are in a data-rich situation, and now we're trying to determine whether we are overfishing. So is overfishing occurring or is no overfishing occurring? And so before we flip to the next slide, which is going to be the voting slide, any questions? Does anybody need a little more time to find that in your risk matrix? I'm sorry, your species matrix. Okay, I think these are pretty obvious, so it's not shocking that you don't have questions yet. When we get down to the qualitative ones, I think that's where people are going to start wondering, what we're getting at there. So I'm going to go ahead and flip. Go ahead and start voting. Is overfishing occurring? Okay, so we can see the majority vote here is that overfishing is not occurring. The highest bar there is number 1, which was no. And so this, now we assign, as I mentioned, the score we're going to give. This one is 2.5%. The reason that number was chosen, and when I'm saying we, I'm talking about the Assessment Science Committee, the Management Science Committee, and the working group. And so what we decided was probably the largest or the smallest step that we want to take is 5% adjustment to risk. And so here you'll be making 2 decisions. Is overfishing occurring and where you are relative to the target? So the accumulation of that stock status determination for this metric, it will total to 5% total, depending on which way the voting goes or the way the assessment dictated that stock status should be read. So here we have said that overfishing is not occurring. That is good. So we're going to subtract out 2.5% from our risk. So once we've made that limit decision, we determine where we are relative to the target. So we've got 2 metrics here for striped bass. We have a limit, the threshold we call it, and then we have a target. And so the first decision you made was on the limit, now the next one is on the target, and that may have been what led to some of the votes where people clicked yes on the last one. And again, we're going to use this 2.5% value again here. So we've made the limit decision, and now we're going to make the target decision. Again, you can get that information right off of the risk matrix. And so here's the level that we are at. Are we above the target or are we below the target? Any questions before we flip? All right, here we go. The time speeds up, by the way, as we go through. I figured we'll give a little more time as we're starting off here, and then it'll go a little quicker. Okay, so here we have decided that we are below the target. That is correct. And so, again, we're going to subtract out a little bit of risk, because stock status with regard to this metric is good. Okay, so that was the fishing mortality decisions. Here is the biomass metric decisions. Again, we're going to start off with the limit decision and then go to the target decision. So same procedure as before, same 2 steps to get to the end of it. 2.5%, just like we did for fishing mortality. You can see how we're progressing down the decision tree here. So we decided that we were below the target. Now we are on the overfished definition. Any questions before we get to the voting slide? Okay, here we go. Whoop. Wrong button, sorry. Lots of buttons over here. Correct decision there. This species is not overfished. And so, again, we're going to subtract out some risk for that. And again, once the limit decision has been made, we determine where we are relative to the target for the overfish status, same as before, and this will be a score of 2.5%, so we've bounced down. I have to drop out layers or else the font gets so small you can't read it anymore, so that's why the tree is now going to kind of stay about the same size. But here's our target decision. Are we below the target or above the target? Any questions before we flip? Okay, vote away. Oh, sorry. The second one should be number 2.
We'll see how that gets interpreted.
So here we are below the target, and so based on the potential confusion of the 2 number 1s up there, I think when we're doing the math at the end, we'll put the right answer in. I suppose this could be interpreted that we are at the target, but we're not. So we'll pretend that we answered that one correctly. Sorry about that. I hope that's not the case in any of the other slides. Okay, this is the final of the quantitative type decisions. Now we're going to think about model diagnostics. And so some of the important diagnostics that we think about with this type of stock assessment are retrospective patterns and sensitivity, so we can test the model's sensitivity to different states of nature, like different fishing natural mortality levels, things like that. We can look at bootstrap bounds, and so we can run a bootstrap or a Monte Carlo routine on the information and see how wide the bounds are. and our ability to estimate recruitment is another diagnostic that we can look at. And so just to provide you a little more information here, for striped bass, there's a modest conservative retrospective. What that means is it over-predicts fishing mortality and under-predicts biomass. So those are conservative. I won't necessarily say good, but it's in a direction where the outcome when you run it the following year is you would have set management in a conservative fashion in that initial year. And so for this one, we're going to assign a 5% score for model diagnostics. These diagnostic problems can be explicitly defined, and so you can talk about things like the retrospective and look at it with regard to confidence bounds, and that's what they're doing in the Science Center with some of the groundfish species. If the retrospective pattern is so large that it falls outside of a 90% confidence interval, that's when they account for it. And so things like that can occur here. And so that's an example of how risk can be explicitly quantified with regard to model diagnostics. This is something I think that's important. So you need to be careful about double counting. And so if you have this procedure where you're already accounting for instance, a retrospective pattern by adjusting your estimate because of that retrospective, you don't need to account for that again in your risk policy because you've already accounted for it and moved that point estimate to account for it. And so it gets a little wonky, but that's something that we need to be cognizant of, and I think I've heard people at this table talk about that. You know, are we double counting for uncertainty and that sort of thing? And so that would be an important example of where you wouldn't want to double count if you're already adjusting. But if you're not, then you'd want to account for that uncertainty through your risk policy. Okay. Okay, so here's where we are. Again, we made our decisions on the overfished status and where we were relative to the... Yeah, go ahead, Adam.
So having sat through the working group, I know the answers to this, but maybe it would be helpful to pass on to the group where on our matrix some of this information is found. For example, the question about overfishing and overfished or not was very easy to find, I think. However, the two items where there was a bit of more divergence in the responses with regards to F relative to the target and SSB relative to the target, because that's found in the text section with the issues, that wasn't as quick to jump out. And now we have this model diagnostics option doesn't jump right off the page for you. So maybe as you're going through each one, you could just update everybody on where to find each of these items for their reference.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And I guess, so for that one in particular, I hadn't expected you. I was sort of offering the answer before we got into it for this one. And so I'm actually not, it shows up in here. I think it is also in that issues section. Do you see it on there, Katie?
Not the retrospective specifically, but
yeah.
there is the major sources of scientific uncertainty on the back.
Okay, yeah, so there's on the flip side of your matrix in front of you, there's a row about, oh, there it is, major sources of scientific uncertainty. And so the reason why I offered you the information I did before we flipped to this slide is if there were a retrospective issue, that's where it would show up. There isn't one for striped bass, so there's not much mention of it here. But I'll take this as feedback. Maybe that's something we need to make sure it's clear on the matrix where the information is located for each of these questions and decision points. So it's a good point, Adam. Yes, Rob.
Thank you, Jay. Can you take a minute or two to give us a little education on retrospective bias? So you mentioned that the Science Center has been working with this, and I certainly remember back in the early 2000s, the guidance was that you don't do anything with retrospective bias for the one reason that maybe the direction changes, so you have to always watch that. So maybe through time, we tried to use it with summer flounder, and there was a 32% retrospective bias that we tried to, as a technical person, we tried to play into the management decision, was not taken into account. For striped bass in 2004, a few of us who are here remember that we went around the room and decided in a Delphi situation that striped bass indeed was not over, there was no overfishing, even though the F was 0.42 and the target was 0.3. And we came to the board and said, well, wait and see the next time the model's updated, everything will be fine with the last terminal year. And that was the case. So this board and many boards have sat around and talked about retrospective. And I guess the important thing that I'm trying to figure out, is it a situation now where the model itself is going to be accounting for retrospective, and that is sort of out of our hands, or is it still a case where that plays into the management decision? That's the fundamental question I have.
Yep, thanks, Rob. And I think it's an excellent question. And so I would suggest, in particular for the striped bass case, the model doesn't do anything explicitly were there to be a retrospective. What I was talking about before with the Science Center, I'll call it, it's like a control option that they put in place, a rule of engagement maybe is a better way to put it. And a lot of it stems from the fact that we have some severe retrospective issues with some of the groundfish species. And the other aspect from the groundfish experience is they're doing so many of them at once, 20 stocks simultaneously, that they need to develop an efficient process to be able to kind of know what to do when they encounter a retrospective issue. And so it's like an external process, a rule of engagement that they've developed that says if that retrospective it is outside of these confidence bounds, that's when they're going to adjust for it. Otherwise, they ignore it. And so that's where now, if something like that came to this board, you would look and you could make that determination, well, it has directionality and it's in a conservative direction, so we don't need to add more a risk-averse option to this decision. If it were in the reverse direction, and even though it didn't fall outside of the bounds, but it was still right on the edge, you might want to add a risk buffer onto that decision. And so it can kind of happen in two ways. And so that's when I'm talking about how these can evolve and be customized by species. Those are the types of things, as we're working through this, we can figure out and say, well, in this case, we like that rule. You guys just handle it, technical committee, and make that adjustment if it's warranted per these criteria. And then if that happens, you're accounting for it and you don't need to double count for it. However, if you don't make that decision and there's a retrospective, the technical committee reports that to you, now you can make a decision about whether or not you want to account for it at the board level. Any other questions? Where are we? Model diagnostics. So any questions before we flip? And again, to Adam's point, I've already suggested that the model diagnostics in the case of striped bass are pretty good, at least per the last update. Okay. Vote away. Okay, even though it was 1 and 1, you still got it. Thank you for that. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. I'm certain I could have missed 1, but I doubt I would have missed 2. I wonder if when we reset it, if something happened. In any case, you picked the right one. I guess if this continues to be the case, number 1 is always the first one, number 2. In some cases, there'll be 3 options, so they go top to bottom, 1, 2, 3. Sorry about that. So model diagnostics are good here, and so what we're suggesting is we don't need to add any uncertainty buffer in this case, so we're going to give it a 0. All right, and so to this point for the striped bass example, all of the things that we've been working with are all quantifiable. And so you can apply an actual number to each step. We applied these really simplistic numbers just to kind of give you a sense of what it could, what that number could do and which way it could move the uncertainty buffer right or left. I think in the real scenario, you'd have different numbers in there, but we wanted to keep it simple. Now we get into the more difficult ones to kind of think through, and so these are what we've been calling the flexibility options. These are the qualitative options that you can deal with, and this is where we imagine, for this process, I imagine the technical committee would fill out those first sets of questions for you. Not to say you can revisit them and bring that up at the board, but at least you'd have the technical guidance to work from. And I would suggest you'd need a pretty good case to move one of those. But in any case, these qualitative decisions, this is now where the board gets to offer their understanding of the fishery locally or comprehensively and, offer guidance by way of risk per that understanding of the stock. So here, if you flip over now the risk matrix, you've got a set of information. I should have said this early on. Max asked me to say this. So this species matrix was put together by Max, and he did the best he could with it. But the information that's in here, please don't take this and go back and wave this up in the air at the next board meeting and say, you gave me this paper and it says this, and now you're telling me something different. Max did the best he could. It's probably pretty good, but when you would get this for real, Jeff's saying so-so, when you use this in a real sense, you would be getting this information directly from the technical committee who would have worked through this and made sure they were all in agreement on the information that's in these cells. But in any case, you've got information on fishing communities and economic and social factors. So you've got some information to work with here. You wouldn't have to necessarily come up with that on your own, and it gives you something if you could, again, disagree with what's in there, but you would have something to reference, which I think would be helpful. So again, you've got this information in front of you. So one of the first qualitative decisions, and this one is kind of on the edge. It could be quantitative. I'll suggest at this point for striped bass, it is qualitative. We don't have anything like a management strategy evaluation or simulation work to give us a sense of how good our management implementation is year to year. But what we want to talk about here is management uncertainty. So we get through all of those other decisions, and then how good are we at implementing management and having that management come out the way we anticipated? And again, this could be quantitative, could be quantified, but at this point, I'm suggesting we don't have that information, so it will be a qualitative decision. And so because it's qualitative, what we thought the easiest thing to do would be to tier it into a low, medium, and high categories, and we scale them up. So if you have management uncertainty, but it's low, then we'll call it 2.5%. If it's medium level of management uncertainty, maybe it's erratic. Some years you're okay, some years you're not. You kind of fall in the middle there. We'll call it 5%. But if you're really bad at projecting what your management is going to do, and it's not that you're bad, but you never know what's impacting the performance of the measures you put in place, we'll give it 10%. So think about that for a minute. Here is the level that we are at now, where we've got management uncertainty, and we want to decide whether it is high, medium, or low once we decide if there is management uncertainty. And so any questions before I flip to the next slide, which would be the first voting slide? Okay, here we go. So is the management uncertainty accounted for in our process? Sorry, yeah, there'll be two slides here. Okay, good job. So this one was a closer vote. So that's interesting. The majority by one vote is that management uncertainty is not accounted for. So we'll add in uncertainty buffer for that one. And now I'm going to flip to the next slide, which will be our ability to now define whether it is low, medium, or high. So actually, we won't be assigning an uncertainty buffer until we make that decision. Okay, go ahead and vote. Looks like the numbers are okay again. Medium. Okay, and so now, based on that initial slide as we let in, that will be a 5% buffer that we'll add there to account for that. Okay, some more qualitative decisions to make. We have ecosystem considerations, and so the two that we've highlighted here are trophic importance and climate vulnerability. So for trophic importance, that's a little bit, difficult to think about. There are ways to quantify something like this. You could do multi-species modeling. You could do meta-analysis on the type of trophic level that your species exists at, or you could just assign it board-chosen risk tolerances. One thing that we discussed as we were working through this stuff is the question here for the board really, is it forage or is it not forage? That would simplify the decisions that need to be made. But we can also see instances where, if you have a high-level keystone predator that impacts a number of other species, that could be important as well. So it's a tough one to think about. I'll suggest in this case, just to keep it simple, let's go with the former categorization. So we know it's this one's not forage, this one's a predator, and so you can make your decision based on that. With climate vulnerability, again, I think there's a couple of quantitative approaches here. For instance, there is the climate vulnerability work that was done by NOAA, and so they have created these systems where they had a group of experts get together and categorize different species as being highly vulnerable to climate change or more tolerant of climate change. And so you can rank these based on that. There are other quantitative things you can do as well. For instance, it could be accounted for if in the model you have a recruitment model that is temperature dependent, and so you've got some accounting, directly in the model, and so that's the kind of stuff you need to think about in this case. We don't have that for striped bass, so I think the best option for striped bass that we have is that climate vulnerability rank, and for striped bass, just to give you a little bit of information, and it may be on the matrix as well, but striped bass was found to be highly vulnerable to climate change in that climate vulnerability exercise. So again, we're going to assign, there'll be 2 questions here, one for the trophic level, and then one for the climate. And then in each case, just like for management uncertainty, we'll figure out first if it's accounted for, and then we'll give it a high, medium, or low category to decide, the buffer that needs to get applied to it. So here's the first one. This is the trophic importance. So do we want it to be, so do we think it's accounted for already? And if not, we'll bounce down to categorize it as high, medium, or low. So any questions before we flip to the next slide? Okay. Do we need to be precautionary due to the trophic importance of striped bass? 1 is yes, 2 is no. Okay, the majority has voted that we do need to account for it, and I'll just try and channel what you were thinking, and it's a high-level predator that's important in the ecosystem, and so the majority decided that that we do need to be precautionary for striped bass. So that gets us now to our second slide, and that's to figure out how important that is, high, medium, or low. Okay, medium. So keeping with that scoring scheme that we've already developed, we'll give that a 5% buffer. And so those were the trophic considerations. Next is the climate effects. And so first is to determine whether climate effects are accounted for already in the assessment. And then the second slide will be to determine what category it's in, if in fact we think it is not accounted for and that we need to account for it in our risk policy. Any questions? Yeah, John.
Jay, just going back to the way you set those risk levels at 2.5%, 5%, and 10%. Obviously, that's all arbitrary, but obviously it makes a huge difference if you're kind of on the border with one of these, is whether you think, well, maybe it's low, maybe it's medium. When these all accumulate, you're going to have big differences in your risk that you see there, right? So as these questions accumulate, do you see people kind of thinking about those things as it moves ahead, that, maybe I should go with low here rather than medium because all of a sudden we're looking very risky?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And so first, I will suggest that, the numbers that we're working with here, you wouldn't need to categorize it necessarily. You could, again, look to some sort of quantitation of it, and so it might maybe I'll step back and say the way that I see this playing out once this gets to the board is, you will, just like you do now, debate these. The difference now will be that you'll be debating explicitly in defining each step why you're voting a particular way or not. And so a motion, could be made that, yeah, our default is 2.5%, but maybe, something less than that is 1% is appropriate. And so the debate would occur at the board. I think it's still, now it's just kind of wide open when you're having those debates and there's no quantification at all, whereas now you've got some sideboards on it and you have a sense of what way to move with it depending on the way you feel it should go. And so, in this case, again, just trying to keep things simple and systematic, we developed this category, but I hope that answers your question. I see it as more deliberative when you are actually going to be using this if you're actually going to be using this in real time at the board.
As long as it's clear to the board that this is still a subjective view of this, we're putting a risk number on it, but it's still based on subjective decision. It's opinions more than it is actually based on a science to a certain degree here.
And so I'll suggest that it could be sort of in the middle there where you're assigning a value with some reasoning behind it. And so, in the case of climate, you could say, I went through the climate vulnerability report and it says it's highly vulnerable. And so, I think it's important that we account for that and add a significant buffer. And someone could counter that argument and say, but if you read into it a little deeper, that highly vulnerable is kind of that overarching score, but there are all of these nuances till you get there. And so that's where the debate can kind of occur at the board. So it's based on science, but the value is not quantified in any fancy way. Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I don't want to derail this, believe me, because I'm just trying to keep up. But one of the questions I have is, when we're voting, and the number of people in the room is going to change every time we vote. Today it's 34. Another time it could be 10. It could be 5. There's a lot riding. I know individually these are small votes that add up to something as we go through the tree. But when I see a vote of 15 to 14 to 1, and that 15 then carries the day in the risk. So 2.5% or 5% goes with that one person's vote who may or may not have understood fully what was going on. I'm trying to understand how a simple majority gets us to a percent that could have a significant difference, especially the way we sometimes are divided. If it's always 15-14, 15-14, 15-14, it means that 49% think it's the other way. How do you account for the vote in your risk? I guess that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about it. So, initially when you were offering your comment, my answer to you was going to be, well, you do that anyways. It's a vote, and sometimes they're really close, and sometimes they're not. However, I think you're suggesting there could be some maybe middle decision that gets made. Oh, that was a really close vote, so maybe there's some default buffer in there. But I guess I wasn't thinking about it with that degree of complexity. I was thinking about these decisions are just like any other decision that the board makes. You vote on a motion, and the majority carries the day.
Just for fun, you've achieved your goal because you've increased my level of complexity this morning. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Katie, go ahead.
I wanted to come back to something I think John was talking about in terms of sort of scientific versus subjective at this point, which I think is a really good point, where we do have a couple of these questions where the answer is this in the model or not? So right now for striped bass, we don't have climate vulnerability in the model, so we have to go to this subjective place where we talk about what is the board value, or how does the board assign risk when we don't have a specific number coming out of that. And similarly for, I think, some of our economic questions later on, where we don't have good socioeconomic data to quantify the decision, you have to fall back on subjective stuff. So definitely in this tree, there are things that are going to be subjective, just the way there are around the board when we're making other management decisions. And so the point of this is to kind of help connect that subjective gut feeling about what the answer is to a number in terms of risk, and is setting a quota down the line and setting these management actions that need numbers attached to them, but in a way that's clear and can be debated and discussed in terms of risk and uncertainty, as opposed to just, I think the quota should be a little higher this time. So I think that's kind of part of it, is to turn these subjective decisions that we make at the board level all the time into something clear and explicit and debatable.
Okay, ready to flip to the next slide and start voting. This, just to jump us back, where we are at is the ecosystem climate effects. And so the first decision is, are they accounted for in the model? And then, to my knowledge, there is not any sort of temperature varying recruitment or anything like that in the model. Maybe somebody knows different, so you can vote that way. Are they unaccounted for, and then how important is that, high, medium, or low? And I've offered you the information from the climate vulnerability study. So any questions before I flip? Okay. Okay, are climate effects accounted for? The answer is no. And now I'm going to flip to the next slide, because now we need to determine how important that is for striped bass. What level of influence are climate effects expected to have, high, medium, or low? Okay, the winner here is high. So I'm guessing based on that climate vulnerability analysis, we expect it to have a high impact as climate change continues to progress. Okay, next qualitative decision, and just to, I don't know how impatient people are getting, so we're almost at the end here, so just bear with us for a little bit longer. So now we're going to talk about economic impacts. This comes up a lot, I think, within the discussions that the board has, but not very explicitly. And so now we have an opportunity to really drill into this to allow board members to tell you exactly why the economics are important. In this case, the way that we frame this is, this category allows you to push back against the buffer to offset economic impacts. So in other words, here we're going to allow you to subtract out some of that buffer that we've been adding as we go through. And so if you believe that this is going to have a high economic impact or a low economic impact, you can sort of make that decision. Again, that same 2.5%, 5%, 10% will be how we scale this. This one could also be quantified at some point. I'll suggest that we don't have that degree of information yet for really any of our species. But this is that, again, that flexibility. So now, as we've been walking through, we've built up a lot of precautionary buffer. Here's how we can now push back against it, take in these other considerations, define them explicitly on the record, and you know, moderate that buffer that we've been accumulating to this point. So here's where we're at. We've got 3 levels, so economic impacts can be low, medium, or high. Any questions before we flip? Okay, vote away. Okay, economic impacts in this case are high. And so here we're going to subtract out 10% to account for that. Social impacts, this is our last category for these qualitative decisions. And so the way, again, we frame this one is to push back against the buffer to offset social impacts, such as importance to subsistence fishers, importance to unique fishing communities that might depend on this species as their sole source of income. So that sort of straddles the line of economic and social. I'm always very sensitive to split these two out because I was talking about this and kept saying socioeconomic, and had a social scientist scold me for that thing. So I'm always careful to split these two things out. Sometimes they overlap, but not always, as I was reminded. So we have this as a separate category. So interestingly, I think social impacts could also go in the opposite direction. And so if you are making a management decision that might be risky to the resource, that could have a negative impact, you know, on some social group or some social aspect of the fishery. And so in this case, I think you'd need to be explicit at the board as to what direction you're talking about your impact. Here, the way that we framed it is, let's keep with that high, medium, low, buffering back against the buffer that you've added. And so if you're going to have a high impact on a particular social group, that is a cause to be more risk prone. And so moving back towards your default 50%. And so just for sake of argument, just to make everybody vote in the same direction, let's have that as our starting point. But I just wanted you to be aware that this one is a little bit more ambiguous as far as the impact and the directionality of that impact. And so same strategy here, low, medium, high, and the scores are up there. And so this is the last level that we are at. Any questions before I flip to the next slide? Okay. Go ahead and vote. All right, so the vote here was that the social impacts are high, and remember that in this case what that means is we're going to remove 10% from the buffer. So, oops. The point that we're at now is we're going to recap all of those and provide you with that final score. So I've been jotting down here, as has Katie, and I think what I'll do is, Katie, if I edit this slide, will it show up? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and edit this directly up here and give you your final result. And so a couple of them I have populated already because I knew the answers from the information in the species matrix, but we started off at a 50% probability. We are in good shape with regard to overfishing, and so we are not overfishing and we are below the target, so that subtracts out 5%. The overfish definition, that was neutral, so we are not overfished, but we are not at or above the target for this one. And so that kind of cancels out in that case. You wouldn't move right or left in the decision tree. The model diagnostics, we said were good, and so we offer that that one is 0. Management uncertainty, you decided that there was management uncertainty and that it was at the medium tier, so that will be a 5%.
Oh, we've turned off somehow.
Okay. That's 5%. For the ecosystem with regard to the trophic level, you offered that that one is also medium. So we'll put a 5% buffer in there. The ecosystem with regard to climate was high, so a high impact for that one. So that is a 10% buffer. The economic impact was high, and so now we're going to subtract out 10% for that one. And actually, I forgot to write down the social. Was that also high? Okay, and then social was also high, so we are going to subtract out 10 there. And so where you ended up, 45? Yeah. Where you ended up is a risk probability of meeting your target of 45%. And so you're, after all of that, I know as we were stepping through the first ones, I was thinking relative to what the ASC and MSC did, you were being very risk averse. And I thought we were going to end up with a higher risk buffer in the case of striped bass. But here, you're being a little more risk tolerant for striped bass, and that's it. So that's where you end up in the end, is you produce this number, and now we have explicit guidance that goes to the technical committee, and everyone knows what to set their projections at, and you know how to calculate your quota. And just to offer the the current state of what we're doing is we often do this sort of thing, but put it all on the technical committee. All right, I want 45%, 50%, 60%. Let's look at those and show us a 5% increase in quota, 10%. And so you have all of this work that's going on, and this refines that approach and makes it more efficient and can lead to less bouncing back and forth, because inevitably the technical committee doesn't produce something that someone wants to see, and so there's that iteration that needs to occur. Speaking of iteration, as we go through this process, again, to keep with the theme of flexibility, if there was a desire to go back, this can be an iterative process. So, you could offer or make a motion to say, I'd like to revisit the social impacts one, and I didn't mention this, and so this can be iterative as well, and provides the board that flexibility. So let me get my cursor on the right screen. Just I need to, I'll click that. I'll go over here. Okay. So this is sort of a summary and the next steps. There's only a couple slides left, so I think we're going to beat that 2-hour workshop time, so it worked out good. So the very first question for the board here is this something you'd like to actually use for the upcoming striped bass assessment process? And there's probably a couple of different approaches. You could have them look at this immediately and start to work through the species matrix and start to think about these questions and do the necessary analyses to put the numbers in that they need for some of those quantified steps. Or we could do this in kind of a test phase where we let the technical committee complete their work on the assessment, get through all of that and then do this, which you can run kind of in parallel with your normal process. But if your answer is yes, we like one of those two options, I think the next step is to send it to the technical committee to review both the tree, the questions in the decision tree, and the species matrix. So there's a little work there that needs to get done, a little bit of refinement that's needed. But in the end, it's important to have the content experts at least take that first crack at it, and then you would have the final say as to what that decision tree looks like and the questions that are on it. You could have them review the decision categories and refine it, add some, subtract some out. If you think this is too much, you could cut it down a little bit. The second thing would be to have them walk through the decisions and assign the appropriate buffers for those quantitative elements. And one of the things that we talked about at the working group is we wondered if you didn't want your stuff, the qualitative stuff, to be biased, you could have them not do those. Or if you wanted some guidance from your content experts, you could have them populate those as well, knowing that you could go in and disagree with them and modify them. So one thing to keep in mind, this is a continuum, and so it could have been that all of the answers, we could have kept accumulating buffer the whole way down, and conversely, we could have been removing buffer the whole way down. And so the risk assignment in the end could be less than or more than 50%, potentially by a lot. And so one of the things you could do is set some bounds on it. So, don't ever go below a 40% probability of meeting your target, or don't ever go above an 80% probability. So you can set some sideboards on that. That'd be another thing to kind of think about. And then remember, the goal here is to be systematic and transparent when incorporating risk into decision making. And Katie really said this well a couple minutes ago. The idea here, you're all doing all of this already, but it's done in a much more amorphous way. And what this allows you to do is step through these questions that you're already answering, in your heads, in your decisions, and write them down. And one of the things, I think it was, it could have been, it was probably both Adam and Lynn Fegley in the working group. One of the real values they saw from this process is it creates a tool for you to talk about this with your constituents, with our stakeholders. I think about the gentleman who, it was during the Striped Bass Board yesterday, he talked about this workshop today and made a comment on it. So my New England sensibility makes me think that he was not being sincere in what he was saying and sort of making fun of us potentially. But, the point of it is we would have an ability to talk to that gentleman and tell him exactly how we arrived at that risk buffer. And so it's a tool for all of us to go back and talk to people and really explain to them, how you got to that final decision. And so I see, a lot of value in the board members who are on the working group saw a lot of value in that aspect of this. And so I think that's all that I have for you. I'm sure there are lots of questions. One thing I've sort of talked about this already, but I did put up, this is what we came up with at the ASC and MSC, a little hard to follow up there, but we were pretty close to what you all decided. I think the difference was the Trophic decision that you made was the big one, where we decided that it was a high-level predator and that we didn't think there was a need to account for a buffer in that case where you all assigned a buffer. So that's the difference. There's probably a couple other small differences, but in the end, you're pretty close to what your technical folks came up with as well. So with that, I will stop talking and take any questions that you might have.
We'll just kind of start looping around. All the New Hampshire folks have something to say, so we'll start with Doug.
So just so I'm clear, the ultimate decision that we made here was we would apply that 45% risk of not exceeding the target. Is that what so it's less than a 50%. So it's actually, we're being a little bit more conservative. Because 45% would be less of a chance as opposed to than 50%. Or will we?
Yeah, this gets confusing. So in fact, here, you are being more risk tolerant because you are going to allow that distribution to be, if you think of a bell curve and you kind of draw a line through the middle of the bell curve, you can shift the bell curve a little bit so you have more probability that you will be, in the case of F, that you'll be above the target, less probability that you'll be below it, but still a lot of probability that you'll be below it, but you're being a little more risk tolerant in your case. So it's not that, 50-50 chance of being on one side or the other. You've skewed that a little bit. So what you decided as a board is that you wanted to be a little more risk tolerant in the case of striped bass.
Dennis, do you have a comment? Richie?
Thank you, Bob. If on some of these, it seemed like when you took the winning percentage, that there might have been almost an equal number in the other two categories. And what if you then averaged all that out? I think that would represent the commission a little closer than this, because it seemed like half the respondents made a fairly major change. So if you put the percentages halfway in between, you see what I'm trying to say? I would think that would make quite a difference. But
go to 7.5 instead of.
Yeah. I think I get what you're saying, but maybe not. So maybe you're offering kind of that could be like a control rule in your process, that if you have a really close vote or a split vote, that you would have some level of compromise in the middle to set it at.
Well, if you had 10 at 10 and 6 at 5 and 3 at 2.5, then wouldn't you just assign those, multiply those out and divide by the total number? Would that?
So I love the process you're talking about. You're talking about like this weighted, that's awesome. I imagine it's sort of complicated to do on the fly during a board meeting. It would be potentially difficult, but I think that's, maybe a really interesting, really new process for the commission where it's not just if you got one vote more than the other side, but now you're accounting for the continuum that exists on the commission. I think that's kind of cool.
Right. It seems like one vote weighted this very heavily. I mean, there were a couple that were almost a tie, and so that made a big jump. And so if you had the one half at 5 and the other half at 10, instead of ending up being 10, it really should have been 7 or something.
Yeah, so I think what I'll do, I think the idea is great, and I've jotted it down, and so I think as part of the next steps, this concept of how could we potentially work in, like a weighting, I don't know if that would then require we always vote with clickers, which might also be awesome, more like a video game. I don't mean to make light of it, but, that would be really helpful as far as doing those calculations on the fly. You'd be able to kind of see exactly. So I've jotted it down, and we'll have that as an element to discuss as we're working through the evolution of this.
Good, Dennis, and I'll go back to this side of the room. Good, Dennis.
Yeah, thanks. This was an exercise, so it's like we didn't really put a lot of thought into each of our answers, whereas I would think in the real world, any one of these questions would have gone through a discussion and analyzing data and things so that we may or may not be getting such a close separation of the votes. You'd think that after informed information that we would reach much more closely to some sort of consensus answer?
I think you're probably right, Dennis, for a lot of them. And the ones where I could see, like what Richie is talking about, is, these, like a social impact one, right? So if you're talking about striped bass and you have communities in the Chesapeake that are really dependent on striped bass, but then up in New England, maybe that's not the case. And so you can, based on the board members' experience with the fishery, they might have a very different understanding of that aspect of the decision tree. And so that's where I can see you, kind of smearing things a little bit. But I think you're right on the more quantitative ones, they should be heavily weighted where you wouldn't have to worry about that as much.
All right, I had 3 hands over there, and then Michelle. So I think I saw Dr. Pierce first.
Well, my comments is somewhat along the lines that Dennis just made, and that is, indeed, you're correct, Jay, that when we vote on any particular issue, one vote carries the day, and that's it, done deal. However, when we vote on issues before us, there's discussion, and after that discussion occurs, a member's viewpoint may change, and that is very important for determining the way to go. For example, one question was influence of climate, and I said medium, and then I turned to my colleague here, and Michael said, no, it's high rainfall. So that's right. I hadn't thought about that. So if we had discussion, I would have appreciated more of that importance, and I would have voted high instead of medium. So this discussion is critical because it has a great impact on the eventual outcome. So this. So I would suggest that perhaps as a way forward to refine this process, this approach, which is good, I mean, I like it, we do something like the Delphi method, right, where you have the initial voting, such as what we just did. Now you see it, the results, let's say it's a tie or close to a tie, and then there's some discussion. So people express their views. Why did they vote the way they did? And that then would result in another vote that would now be influenced by the opinions of others who would bring forward information that might have been missed. Information, for example, in that one pager. It just makes for more informed decision making, and I think it would help to give everyone greater confidence in the usefulness and the validity of the outcome. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great comment. I think you've offered, a nuance to what Richie was offering, this kind of weighting idea where yours is iterative, getting at the same concept, though, to see if you can push things in one direction or another. I'll offer that I didn't anticipate you changing your deliberative process very much, and so this would be kind of a new, that iterative approach would be new, but I've jotted it down and we'll carry that forward to discuss.
Dave Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would have raised my arm, but I tore my rotator cuff during the striped bass discussion yesterday because the chairman wouldn't recognize me.
You got to sit down this way further.
Richie made a great point, I was going to make exactly that same point. I think it would be fascinating, for instance, just with this exercise, to take the numbers and responses and do what Richie said and see how it changes the risk rating that we ended up with for just this. And the other point I would make is that if we use the same technique, I like the technique. If we would use the same technique when we were doing the commissioner survey, for instance, and we had see trumpets blaring on my left. But if we did it when we did the commissioner evaluation of the effectiveness, our effectiveness ratings, and did exactly what Dave Pierce just described, which is put the issue up, had a discussion, let everybody kind of weigh in on the pros and cons and different issues. We could do the same thing on a risk policy, and then voted. You would get a much more accurate reading, because I would be listening to people on the other side of the table making points that I wouldn't consider otherwise. So I think the discussion issue is kind of a valuable addition to all of this.
Yeah, I totally, absolutely 100% agree. That is, I guess, jumping way up to the highest level, that is the value of this approach. It's that collective understanding of things, and being able to listen to people from different areas, and in particular, when you're taking that survey monkey poll and I'm going through the questions, I think about it in a very specific way at that point in time, and I maybe didn't think of something that someone else thought of, but had I heard them in a discussion, I would have considered that. And again, I couldn't agree more, and I think that aspect is the really attractive part of this, where that discussion can be really focused around an explicit question, and so people have an opportunity to be well researched as they come into the meeting and can think about all of these aspects. So yeah, great point.
Michelle.
Thanks, Bob. So Jay, can you put up the next step slide again, please? And while Jay's looking for that, I'll just say that I agree with what Richie has suggested in terms of a weighted approach and the points made by Dave Borden and Dave Pierce with regard to the value of the discussion and how that influences everybody around the table having enough information to be able to make an informed choice. And so I guess I'm just wondering so Jay, is the plan to kind of take some of this feedback right now, because there are certainly some new things that have come up that it doesn't sound like the work group necessarily discussed or had an opportunity to think about or came up in your brainstorming. So would the idea be to take some of these suggestions that have been made back to the work group to refine this a little bit more? I mean, I know that one of the questions asked here was, do we want to go ahead and use this for the upcoming striped bass assessment? I really like the tool. I would like to see it used. I do think, as Katie said, it really, it allows us to be very explicit with regard to some of the conversations that we have around the table. I'm just wondering does it need to go back to the work group first to address a couple of the points that have been made around the table, and then, the decision tree itself is part of the briefing materials for the May board meeting, so that everybody can be prepared to have those informed discussions, and then the striped bass board goes ahead and fills it out. So those are the types of next step questions that I'm wondering about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Great question. And so I'll start with what I thought. So. And, Adam, feel free to jump in if you want to speak as well as a member of the working group. But just to start off, I feel like we went through as best as we could at this point, not being, well, I'll speak for myself, not being an expert on striped bass per se. The folks on the technical committee are no more. They've been doing it for longer than I have. And so I think we, the working group, as kind of a collection that weren't necessarily striped bass people, have taken it as about as far as we could go. And so I thought the next step for further refinement would go now to the experts, go to the technical committee. But that, that could be feedback that we get that, no, we think you guys should iron out a couple of these things first before it gets to that level. And so so that was my opinion, but I guess that would be good feedback to know, so we know where to go with it.
Just a quick follow-up. So, and I only asked that because I view this as sort of like, we use striped bass as the example for this template that we want to be able to apply for all of our species. So that was the only reason why I asked whether or not you thought it might be appropriate to go back to the work group. I mean, certainly it could go to the striped bass technical committee to, refine some of those quantitative things. I do think for the qualitative stuff, I would probably prefer that the board, have those discussions and provide our input on those qualitative questions rather than asking the technical committee to do that. But that's just my opinion. Thanks.
Adam and Jeff. Great, thanks. Adam, do you have any feedback on that? And then I'll go to John McMurray.
Yeah, well, I think that this was a great discussion. I appreciate leadership giving the time to this because I think it was a great exercise to go through in the feedback. I think that the example we did is great, but my opinion is I think there's more work for the working group to do before we put this for any other species. Specifically, we looked at one species-specific example. You talked about maybe some bounds, but the fact that right now it's not bounded. Imagine if we use this approach and came up with a 30% probability of achieving the target for menhaden. We'd have a public uproar the size of which we never could conceive of. So I think when we consider I think we have specifically tasked for the working group would be to look at the feedback we have here, 2, to look at a couple of other species examples and how it might impact, and the third item is we've only developed one branch of the tree. There are a lot of other branches of the tree here. And I would have concern about putting in place a policy that only is for one outcome that we knew ahead of time. I think we'd have to do some further development. And those 3 areas, I think, would be something the working group should be working towards as next steps.
Yeah, Adam, great comment. And so I wonder then, I'm going to use Richie's weighting scheme here. I wonder if the reason I offered what I did is there are some things that, I'm not as comfortable answering. So I wonder if the compromise here is to have the working group meet with the striped bass technical committee to kind of work through those, or maybe what you're suggesting is we're still up a level from striped bass at this point. But so I think you're exactly right on like the bounds and some of those aspects. I think the working group could handle those. If we're going to drill into some of these more specific striped bass specific questions, I think we need the striped bass technical committee. So it'll depend on if maybe I'm jumping 2 steps ahead and maybe I need to get reined in a little bit. It's not uncommon.
Let's see where the conversation goes, and then we can decide on next steps here as we wrap this up. John, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I may have torn my rotator cuff also. This may be outdated at this point, but it is relative to the point Richie brought up and some of the other points made. But one of the things that really struck me with this exercise was the ambiguity in a lot of the questions, particularly, and you flagged this, Jason, the social and economic impacts. I mean, they can go both ways as far as taking fish out of the water versus leaving them in. There are different user groups. So that needs to be clarified before we answer any question like that. The other one that struck me was the trophic importance. And I was unsure how to answer that one as well, because are we talking about being less precautionary because of their place as a predator? Are they eating too many of other species? Or are we talking about being more precautionary because of uncertainty on how climate change is affecting habitat and spawning in year classes? So all that needs clarification. I'm assuming that will happen as we develop this, if we do use it. But I did want to flag it.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think, clarifying the questions and making them user-friendly so everybody's answering from a similar perspective is important, for sure. Yes, Dr. Armstrong. I saw you there, Mike. I was looking out for your hand.
First off, if we had these bad boys yesterday, we could have done striped bass in 5 minutes. So I'd encourage you to move forward with those. One of the things that jumped out is at certain points, because of the generality, particularly economics, I can't envision the mere presence of a board means that species is economically important. So it seems maybe not the croaker board, I don't know. But most boards are going to come out high all the time. That's how I envision it, which means it would become a scalar, and as a metric, it's not useful anymore, right? So maybe that economic part needs to be a little more complicated. That's how I see it.
Yeah, no, that's a really good one, Mike. I think, yeah, in the end, economics, that's can be a hard science, mathematical, and so I think that one could be much more refined. Again, working kind of up at a higher level in the working group, it wasn't clear, what the exact economic issues with striped bass, what those were. And so that's why we kept it at that high level. But I totally agree, because you're probably right. It's sort of we can make that presumption. We can always just, knock 10% off right at the top. But I shouldn't be so glib. People might argue that it's middle of the road or something like that. But you're right. So it's good feedback, and keep thinking on that one.
Thanks. I saw David and David, but before I get to you guys, I'll go to a new voice, if you don't mind. John Clark hasn't commented yet, and I'll come back.
Thank you. Some of the topic has been brought up already, just about making sure the questions are asked in ways that are not leading. And then on that same subject, I think, as Mike brought up, making sure that they're balanced. So, it seems to me that if you ask more questions on one side, you could end up skewing your total risk. Like if you ask more on the quantitative side than the qualitative side or whatever. But finally, just when you explain this to stakeholders, people are notoriously poor at evaluating risk. For example, people are more afraid of dying from a shark attack than they are from crashing in an automobile, for example, or going for it on 4th down in the Super Bowl is another example of people not about. Well, in this case, the Eagles did evaluate risk properly. But I'm just saying that was a good example. Most people would not have evaluated risk that way. But just explaining it once again, it's people are not great at evaluating these type of risks. Is all I'm saying.
John, all the New England guys just voted against you. Sorry about that. Any other folks that haven't commented yet? And I'll go back to David Borden. So, seeing none, David.
Just a quick point that I think the working group should also be sensitive to seeing how people might game the system, which in a mathematical context, you load it up on certain questions, and if you're going to start averaging, it's obviously going to have an impact.
Absolutely. Dr. Pierce, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, ASMFC is different from the federal management councils. We have more latitude. We're not, for the most part, obliged to live by the national standards. However, with scup, sea bass, and fluke, and a few others, but certainly those three, when we manage with the Mid-Atlantic Council, the bottom line is always going to be 50%. I mean, with regard to risk, we can't be risk prone or more willing to accept risk by going with 45%, for example. The Mid-Atlantic Council can't do that, right? It's got to be 50% probability. Otherwise, the flies in the face of the court decision that has forced us to go with a 50% probability. So with the council involved in these sorts of discussions, or when we interact with them, it's always going to be how much more precautionary do we need to be. We'll never be able to go below 50% relative to the amount of risk that we want to take. So that's something to consider. Striped bass, menhaden afford, these opportunities for us to be, let's say, more thoughtful with regard to considerations that we feel are important to address. Now, if we did this, again, in the presence of Mid-Atlantic Council members, and of course there are many around the table, it would just result in some interesting discussion with the Mid-Atlantic Council members perhaps wanting to be like ASMFC members more so than council members, and they might favor the 45%, but they've got the handcuffs on, either 50% or be more precautionary. So that's just a point I wanted to make regarding the approach and how, with regard to at least those three species, this exercise, cannot be undertaken unless, of course, we want to be examining how much more precautionary do we feel we need to be. Socioeconomic impacts really don't factor in a meaningful way. Plus, I'll get to my bottom line problem with the whole process. When it comes to calculating risk, be it 50%, 45%, 60%, I'm still struggling after all these years with probability calculations for whether we're going to achieve our objectives or not. I know that in the past, going back to see how successful we were in achieving our objectives, we started off in one particular instance with fluke years ago with a 100% probability that we would not be overfishing. And when all the numbers came in, we were overfishing. So probability distributions still bother me. I realize they're mathematical calculations, but this is fishery science, and we're obliged to live with those calculations, and of course the technical people do an admirable job providing them, but I take them all with a grain of salt.
So I'll be quick. I mean, I don't disagree with anything you said, Dr. Pierce. I think, one aspect of this, I think I've said this to this group before, so this was specifically about the F target, and I think everything you said is absolutely correct. But there are other things that we do where a process like this could be valuable. For instance, part of our process in that Mid-Atlantic process is you have a monitoring committee that assigns management uncertainty. And so that is a step that is in the control of the commission, and so we don't have a very systematic process for that. And so that could be another application of this type of systematic approach. So there is, even for those jointly managed species, a place for this type of a process. But in general, they've accounted for all of the scientific uncertainty in their processes, and so you wouldn't need to do this for those species specifically.
Thanks. Any other thoughts or comments? Doug Grout.
Just one last one to what Mike Armstrong was saying about some of the subjective questions, the economic and the social impact. I think the key there is going to be how you word the question. He's probably right. For most states, with striped bass, we might be saying, yeah, it's economically important coastwide into our state. But for example, if I was applying this on black sea bass and the question was, is it economically important to my state? I'd say, no, it's low. But if the question was, is it economically important to the Atlantic coastal states? I'd say, yes. So on those suggestion questions, it's how we word the questions that are going to be very important.
Great, thanks. Well, we are bumping up or a few minutes past the 10 o'clock deadline. It sounds like, a lot of good feedback, I think it was a great exercise. I think Adam, painted a picture moving forward pretty well, and with Jason's comments about, bring this feedback back to the working group, let them work on it a little bit more. They can provide an update at the May meeting. Is that fair, or is that too ambitious? We'll see how far they can get by the May meeting. We may have an update in spring. If not, we're going to do it later in the summer and just see how it goes. So with that, well, I think we can wrap this up. I think, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Katie and Adam and Lynn. And I don't know who else is on the working groups. I apologize for leaving them off. But thanks for all the time you guys have put into this. This has been, I think it's a great exercise. It's the direction the commission needs to go in. Apparently, the commission needs to go price out purchasing some little clickers because this seems to be pretty popular. So we'll see what that costs. But I implore you, do not steal the clickers. We rented these and we have to return them, and it costs a whole lot of money. So don't steal the clickers. So with that, I think that we'll wrap up this workshop for now, and we'll take about a 10-minute break or so and then get the policy board going. Does that sound good? All right. Thank you all.